Going to give a talk, a case presentation, and they asked me to finish this Medicare analysis of paclitaxel. And so I think the good thing is that next week we're going to be presenting some updated data at the FDA panel. And one of the charges for the next round of analysis is to understand how we can use this real-world data to overcome some of what we've seen in the randomized trial data, or at least on the same standing as that. And so it'd be great to get some of your feedback as clinicians and researchers in terms of how we can balance the use of real-world data against randomized trial data in terms of assessing safety for our devices as used in the last case. And Sahil gave some of our data from earlier today. And again, we've gotten a lot of attention over the last couple months, particularly after the March letter that kind of halted the use of drug-coated devices. And as we saw in that letter, really the charge was to not use these devices unless patients were at particularly high risk, primarily those of restenosis. And so what we've been doing since those two papers have been published is really examining how we can take real-world data and convincingly show that safety can be examined in this type of data without bias or confounding. And so as people in this room are well aware of that, really a lot of healthcare decisions and charges, even by the FDA, have been made to use real-world data to evaluate safety decisions, regulatory decisions, coverage decisions, and develop guidelines. And we've seen a lot of increasing use of different sources in the US from different databases. The rationale for evaluating CMS data is multiple. First off, it's the clinical validity. It has an extensive amount of data available in it, including specific codes for procedures, sociodemographic data, sources of care. But in addition to that, it's a wide population of coverage. So almost 98% of patients in the US above 65 are enrolled. Almost 100% of all deaths among patients over 65 are captured. And we have a lot of extensive track record for using this in outcomes research. And the quality has been tied to reimbursement. So if a procedure is tied to a payment, you're more likely to capture that procedure accurately than if it's a diagnosis code that's not tied to reimbursement. And so we've kind of developed these best practices for using these data in terms of research questions. And I kind of covered these, but again, making sure that we have codes that cover diagnostic precision, consistency and exposure, making sure that we don't lack important data, and that we have an active comparator, or in this case, it would be an uncoated device versus a coated device. We also, spend a lot of time thinking about how do we make sure we're not misclassifying. And again, the reason why we've used these codes in the ICD-10 era is that in comparison to ICD-9, you can really dive into the combination of therapies that are being used for each lesion. So drug-coated and uncoated technology when they're combined into one procedure or separated into separate technology use. And this is both for the inpatient and outpatient setting when there's pass-through codes to add on drug-coated balloons and stents. And again, like we said in the previous slide, that when coding is tied to compensation, it's used more accurately, and that's really why it was important when we've been reimbursing for drug-coated balloons up to the end of 2017. So at the end of 2017, the additional payment code for outpatient procedures using the drug-coated balloon ended, but prior to that, these procedures were being compensated differently and it made it easier to track. And again, in this situation, we're looking at non-randomized treatment. And so when you use paclitaxel devices, I'm sure everybody in the room who are clinicians understand that we are typically not determining treatment based on a patient characteristic, but per guidelines and appropriate use criteria, it's really based on the lesion and lesion complexity. And drug-coated devices are indicated for really any type of fem-pop lesion, complex anatomy, heavy calcification, and stent restenosis. And it's often used in patients with the higher burden of comorbidities, so the diabetics, the elderly, the active smokers. So in any perfect world, if we're going to combine two therapies and have some differences, in this case it biases the drug-coated group to worse survival. And we saw this when we looked in the prior data. Sahil kind of showed this slide earlier, but patients who got drug-coated technology had more incidence of congestive heart failure, higher rates of diabetes, and other comorbidities that made them the sicker group of the two groups. So we also play with the data a little bit, and play is probably not the right word. We examine the data to make sure that there's no way to looking at it in a different approach through different types of analysis and getting a different answer. So the goal with any type of data analysis is to say, well, we can do it one way and we can do it another way, and we're going to get similar corresponding results. And so this is the type of stuff we've been preparing for next week's panel. And so again, just to cover what we did, previously in this JAMA cardiology paper has had over 16,000 patients with up to 600 days of follow-up, and we found no difference in mortality through that period. We then adjusted for all those comorbidities I talked about to make sure that there wasn't some imbalance that would have favored one group over another at survival. And it didn't matter if patients had critical limb ischemia or no critical limb ischemia. And again, we did that in a longer period of follow-up for just stents. 50,000 patients, as Sahil showed earlier. And again, no difference in mortality at 1,440 days. It didn't matter if we adjusted or didn't adjust, we saw no difference in survival risk. And again, separating by CLI and non-CLI, you see these survival curves are overlapping. So next week is the circulatory systems device panel. We're all preparing, and at that time we'll be presenting some new data. And for this data, we're going to be examining for the first time the outpatient procedures. So a different mix of patients where we only had inpatients before, and you'll see a different demographic. We also have a much greater longitudinal mortality out past 3 and 4 years to present at the time, and a much larger data set to examine different subgroups. So next week we'll learn more about this, and there's a lot of other data to come that we're all excited to kind of get out.